Okay, I guess this is going to be part 2 of this LS7 build. And I finished sanding up the trailing edge of the rudder, and it came out really well. It's nice and straight, sharp, and very, very rigid. And I've also sanded the tips on the horizontal tail. I need to round them off, and I sanded the sub-trailing edge there. So all that's looking really good, and we got the moving portion, the elevator. It's looking great. So the next thing to do is kind of do this part of the rudder, and that's going to involve this plastic tube, 2 balsa strips here, which will go on either side of that, and this big piece of balsa here, which will go on top, and then there's these tip blocks. So let's get started, see what happens. Here's how this is looking. Got all those pieces glued up with that plastic tube running down the center. It's getting pretty heavy actually, but there's a lot of sanding to be done now on this. Basically got to completely round off this edge and obviously sand all these flush. So we'll start on that. I sanded the blocks that I glued onto the back of the rudder here, or the front I should say. So again, we have these 2 pieces of balsa and this big block here, which you can kind of see. I've sanded this way on both of them with 100 grit, then 220, and now I've glued on these hardwood tip blocks with some wood glue, so I need to let that dry completely. And there is that plastic tube running all the way through. So when the wood glue is dry, I'm going to attempt to sand this radius for the basically the hinge line, and then we'll shape the tip blocks here, and we'll have to make these cuts into the post or the rudder fin or whatever you want to call it for the little clips that actually hinge the rudder. So hopefully pretty soon we'll be able to actually get the rudder hinged onto the fuselage. And the other thing I got to work on is putting a horn in the elevator here. Man, sanding this rudder kind of took a while, but I'm really happy with the way it came out. I get the hardwood caps here and here, and those are sanded nicely, and I tried to match the profile. And then I've rounded off this part here to match this. And the next thing I'm going to do is cut these slots right here, and I've marked them. So we'll just kind of slowly start cutting those, probably with a Dremel. And the one thing I noticed was the rudder is kind of too long. It actually kind of extended down quite a bit and didn't really want to fit in the fuselage, so I had to do a lot more sanding here than what's shown. But anyway, it came out okay, so let's try cutting these slots out. I managed to cut these slots out, and I gotta say, this rudder is kind of a work of art. It's a little tiny piece, but I put a lot of effort into it, and it's just pretty fantastic the way it came out. And this is an aluminum rod right here. This is basically the hinge, the pivot for the hinge that goes all the way through the rudder. See that right there. I don't think on the plans they called for it sticking completely out, but I just ran that plastic tube all the way through. And then there's 2 of these little plastic clips, and these get bonded into the fin, and theoretically these should like snap over the aluminum rod. I don't know if I could do this one-handed. well, theoretically anyway, I'll play with that. I wonder how big that opening is. So yeah, so that's fantastic. Love that. And the next thing I'm going to do is, I didn't realize that you had to make a cutout here for the pivot of the rudder. And that kind of makes sense now, because I thought, well, the rudder was too tall by a good 6 millimeters, and now it's basically the same size as the fin. So if I make that cutout, which is right here, you see that, it should fit quite well. So I'll do that, and then we're going to play with getting these glued into the fin post. Moving right along, I've drilled the hole here for the elevator horn, and that gets put in at an angle. I'm going to have to cut that horn down, it's a bit too long. And I've sanded the tips, those are looking really good. Sanded the hardwood tips on the moving part of the elevator. That's looking great on the rudder. I drilled the hole for the horn, and again I'm going to cut that down a little bit so I can sink it a little deeper. And these slots just came out amazing, and I have those plastic pieces in there, you can see right there, and solid aluminum rod going through. And I have cut the holes in the fin post, and you can see those two pieces of balsa right there, taped to the fin post. And I don't know if I can show you this, but basically the purpose of those is to space the rudder out appropriately so that it can move back and forth without rubbing the side of the fuselage. So it's about 3 millimeters spaced, or about 1/8 inch right there. So the next thing to do is I'm going to actually glue these plastic bits into the fin post with some thickened epoxy. Alright, I got those rudder hinge mount things epoxied in, and the rudder's taped in place. The pins in there, the hinge rod. And you can see these shims I made, and these are just to hold the rudder like centered in the fin post to get like an even gap. And there's the top view there, so everything's looking quite good. So we'll cross our fingers that I didn't get any epoxy anywhere that it's not supposed to be. And we'll let that cure, and that'll basically wrap up the rudder, minus covering it and gluing the horn in, so that's really nice. And I might just briefly take a look at that mechanism, or that rod that goes in the fin post that attaches to the push rod to drive the elevator. Man, this rudder came out awesome. It is super free, zero resistance. Everything came out great, so I'm very happy with that. And next thing I'm going to look at is this bit of linkage here that goes from the long push rod for the elevator up to the horizontal. And it's made of these little pieces of dowel with these grooves cut in them, a couple pieces of wire, and this carbon rod. Happy to see a carbon rod here. Should be nice and stiff. So I'm going to have to cut this down a little bit, a little shorter, and then cut these rods, and kind of we'll dry fit everything before it gets glued together. Well, I cut this carbon tube down, and I've prepared the ends here. So you can see the rod, the clevis, and I just put a little wrap of Kevlar on these, just to give them make them a little stronger, and just to hold the pieces together while I epoxy them into this carbon tube. So I'm just going to mix up some epoxy and get these glued in, and that'll basically complete this piece of linkage here for our elevator control system. And really after that, I can't really do much more work on the tail. I might get the servos kind of dry fit in the fuselage and try to hook up the push rods, but we'll see what happens. Alright, I'm going to attempt to dry fit the servo and get the push rod kind of hooked up a little bit, not permanently, but just cut things to length and see how the servo goes in. And in the box that I got from Carlton were these really old Multiplex servos, and this is them right here. So I guess we're going with a vintage build on this guy with some ancient servos. So that's what he supplied, and that's what we shall use. I skipped ahead a few steps, and I got these servos test fit. The arms are on there, the push rods are hooked up, the couplers are soldered to the steel pushrod wire, and I've put these mounts that were included with the kit, or these pushrod braces or supports, on both sides, and I actually put a few more kind of further back. That's just a couple of pieces of foam, and then I put epoxy around it because there's a large expanse here that was unsupported. And these push rods stand off the fuselage quite a bit. Actually, this support I had to space off with some plywood because the rudder arm on the servo needs to be fairly short. And then there's the elevator, so that's looking all great. Carlton sent me 3 boxes of these servos, but only 2 of the boxes had a servo in it, so I need to get another one here, because apparently we're going to do a tow release. Why not? So that goes there. And then back at the tail, the horns are in place. They're not permanently glued in, and the push rods are obviously all hooked up there. There's the elevator linkage. It's kind of hard to see. But yeah, that's all looking great. So not much more I can do on the tail. I'm not going to permanently glue the horns until I cover the tail part, so I'm just going to disassemble the tail and put those aside. And this epoxy I put on here is still curing, so we'll let that sit for a while. And yeah, a fuselage is not done, but it's, I'd call it like 90%. So we're going to just set all the fuselage parts on the tail side, and we're going to start having a look at the wing. So that's going to wrap it up for this video, and hopefully in the next one you'll see me working on the wings. So talk to you guys later. Bye.